find the perpetrators. At its height, about 70 investigators devoted their careers to providing justice for the victims' families. The task force, called EPANA, has been successful in finding the murder of 16-year-old Colleen McMillan. Thanks to DNA, they were able to link American Bobby Fowler to her rape and murder, though he was dead by the time his involvement was uncovered. They believe Fowler could also be responsible for at least 2 more murders on the Highway of Tears. EPANA also saw the conviction of Gary Handlin for Monica Jack's murder in 2019. He is also charged with the death of Catherine Mary Herbert. This work toward justice, in part thanks to the science of DNA, is revealing that the Highway of Tears was stalked by more than one serial killer. This led us to wonder if there is a geographical component to serial killing. Statistics of U.S. states have been collected for victims of serial murder from 1985 to 2010. New York wins the dubious honor with 137 victims. This is not too hard to believe, as New York City provides anonymity. Next comes California, the breeding ground for people like the Hillside Stranglers and Charles Manson. And in third place is Florida, where Ted Bundy finished his treachery. Most interestingly is the state of Washington, which for that time period had the highest per capita number of serial killer victims, 1.6 per 100,000. After all that, it might seem that the United States has more serial killers than any other country. But Dr. Mike Amat, a forensic psychologist who studied 5,000 serial killers around the world, begs to differ. In the United States, we have much more open records than other countries do. If the U.S. had a higher murder rate than the rest of the world, I would be more likely to believe that we have more serial killers, too. But compared to other countries, in terms of the murder rate, we're right around the middle. First, law enforcement has to discover the murders and link them back to the same killer. That means you need competent law enforcement agencies, which the U.S. has. The second part of being able to track serial killers is, once the killer is identified, it has to be announced by law enforcement and made available in prison records. The information must be available to the public. Okay, so maybe we have the most recorded serial killers, but not the actual most. England, South Africa, and Canada are at the top of the list under the U.S. It seems that American serial killers have just had more of a chance to be depicted in the media. And as Dr. Amat explains, our law enforcement and record-keeping only make it seem that we have an overwhelming amount. At least we hope that's true. Because although it might be rare to be killed by a serial murderer, they are real. They can climb into your window, they can stop, wearing a smile, and offer you a ride. From 1980 to 1990, Alaska had the largest per capita of serial killer victims in any state, 15.64 per million. The Highway of Tears spans hundreds of miles. It cuts through the land of many First Nations, carving its way to cities beyond. For too long, women unknowingly walked into a snare. Not just one man, but several took it upon themselves to choose darkness over light. As the science of DNA blossoms and investigative techniques improve, more light shines on the Highway of Tears. Chapter 24. The Man from the Train. Unsolved. One of the most compelling unsolved mysteries that I, Meg, have been drawn to over the years is the tragic murder of the Moore family in the sleepy town of Villisca, Iowa. The parents, their 4 children, and 2 visiting kids were all bludgeoned by an axe on the night of June 9, 1912. Someone moved from room to room, systematically snuffing out the lives of innocents. What haunts me is the senselessness. In the case of the famous Clutter family murders, documented in Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, 1966, there is a clear motive of robbery. Even serial killers like Dahmer and Bundy have a type that they are motivated to kill repeatedly. With the Moore's murders, there is an overwhelming sense of randomness. They lived in an unassuming house in an unassuming farm town. They were church-going average American citizens with no untoward business practices or tantalizing secrets. This is the collective fear, that although we may live our lives with wholesome intentions, make few enemies, and mind our own business, the boogeyman can still come for us. He can creep into our homes where we feel the safest and take our lives with one vicious strike of an axe. The axe has long been a murder weapon in both brutal reality and the fake blood-soaked world of film. Stanley Kubrick famously altered the croquet mallet from Stephen King's novel The Shining, 1977, into an axe for his 1980 film adaptation. In 1964's Strait Jacket, Joan Crawford plays a woman who is accused of multiple axe murders. And let us not forget the horror comedy So I Married an Axe Murderer, 1993, in which comedian Mike Myers plays a man realizing he may have been impetuous in falling in love with a mysterious woman, Nancy Travis, surrounded by a high body count. Perhaps Lizzie Borden is to blame for this fixation on the female and the axe, or maybe it is rooted in something more fundamental. In Yoruba mythology, the axe is the symbol of the god of lightning and thunder, Shango. In some altars to Shango, there is a depiction of a woman with the blade of an axe stuck in her head. In the ancient Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, the double-headed axe was a symbol of feminine strength. It was the symbol of the mother goddess and signified the authority of women, matriarchy, and female divinities. A woman carrying a double-headed axe in the Minoan civilization indicated that she held a powerful position in society. On the Masonic Trowel, a website devoted to the Masonic Brotherhood, axes are equated with duality. The axe is one of the oldest tools of modern man. As with so many symbols, it has a dualistic association, in this case representing both destruction and creation. In prehistoric times, axes were made from stone, which sometimes created sparks. Many ancient cultures associated sparks with thunder, which in turn was known to have great powers. Native Americans, the Chinese, and even the Celts called axes thunderstones. As such, axes became closely associated with power, both the power of destruction and the power of creation. At the turn of the 20th century, the axe was an object of industry. It was a tool of the lumberjack, the building pioneer, the industrious farmer. It created livelihoods, and in the case of numerous murders, like the tragedy in Villisca, Iowa, it destroyed hundreds of lives. Across the country, not long before the Moore family met their demise, the Axeman of New Orleans stalked the French Quarter. The serial murderer, who was never caught, killed 6 and injured yet another 6 with the blades of their own axes. He, like the Zodiac and BTK, enjoyed sending letters to the newspapers. What follows is a lengthy letter he hoped would strike fear into the heart of New Orleans. Hottest Hell, March 13, 1919. Esteemed mortal of New Orleans, the Axeman. They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am. for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise, and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am. But I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, and the worst, for I am in close relationship with the Angel of Death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed either in fact or realm of fancy. The Axeman. After this letter hit the press, the citizens of New Orleans crowded homes and bars playing jazz throughout the night. It seemed to work, as no one was killed that night. According to New Orleans lore, victims of the Axeman haunt their former home. Witnesses have claimed to hear ghostly shrieking in the vicinity of the Maggio house, where Joe and wife Catherine met their grisly end. What is the psychological impetus for taunting the police? Both the BTK killer and the Zodiac sent letters, as did Jack the Ripper and the Son of Sam, while other serial predators provoked the authorities in other ways. The Hillside Stranglers, cousins Angelo Bono and Kenneth Bianchi, left the bodies of their victims on hillsides in plain sight near police stations. The Golden State Killer called his victims before and after their attacks, and also called the Sacramento police to tease them about how he was the rapist they were after, and that he had already staked out his next victim. One assumption could be that some serial killers share a strange desire to be caught. Criminologist James Allen Fox notes that these killers probably are not as self-destructive as they seem. He, BTK, felt invincible, unstoppable, and that's why many serial killers do communicate with the police, not because they're looking for capture. Forensic psychologist J. Reed Malloy describes it as both a desire to link with law enforcement and a desire to devalue it. On the other hand, the taunting could also simply be an expression of hubris, if the criminal believes his system of communication is foolproof, or it could be a need to ratchet up the risk because the contest with police has become as intriguing as the crime itself. Or even more simplistic, experts say, it could be a way of getting more attention. When they are caught, most serial killers usually have a stash of newspaper clippings about their crimes. The Unabomber followed his threat against LAX with the claim that it was just a prank to remind people that he was still around. Okay, so maybe these reasons aren't so nuanced after all. Like most compulsions of serial killers, this need to taunt seems to be one born of a larger-than-life ego. Axe killing could be seen as an overt act of drama, too. Instead of killing with something more quiet, like poison, or quicker, like a pistol shot to the head, axe murders are bloody, brutal, and painful. Axe murders are aplenty, too, spanning the centuries and in countries all over the world. While the Villisca murders appear random in isolated research, patterns have emerged in the early 20th century, specifically from 1898 to 1912, to indicate that the Moore family may have been the victims of a serial killer. Authors Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James posit this fascinating development in their book, The Man from the Train, The Solving of a Century-Old Serial Killer Mystery, 2017. Through tireless research, this father-daughter duo unravel a shocking series of axe murders that spanned across the United States and even in Canada. These murders share quite a few similar traits that lead many to now believe that a serial murderer was traveling the rails of America, on a mission to murder as many as he could. One point of fact is that many axe murders during this era happened eerily close to a train track. This would be a convenient way for a murderer to hop off, commit a crime, and hop back on undetected. While numerous small American communities were grappling with the notion of a killer in their midst, it could be that the man who had taken an axe to an entire family time and time again was long gone. Because media traveled at a snail's pace mere decades ago, and also because a serial killer was a phrase not yet known or understood, it seems that this mysterious man from the train could be one of the most depraved and prolific serial killers to simply not be recognized as existing until he was long dead. One of my favorite aspects of the book is that at the end, James and McCarthy James actually reveal who they believe the man from the train is. To learn more about the man from the train, as well as the axe as a murder weapon, we spoke with co-author Rachel McCarthy James, whose upcoming book, Whack Job, explores the history and legend of the axe. Kelly, first, can you tell us what it was about this particular unsolved string of cases in The Man from the Train that compelled you to dive deep? Rachel McCarthy James. We had an advantage in that we already knew there was a pattern found in a lot of crimes from 1911 to 1912. It was my dad's insight that there were crimes before those, and he found the first of them in Hurley, Virginia in 1909. He believed that the crimes were too practiced to be the work of a new killer, but he couldn't find anything in the years right before the 1909 event, so he hired me. At first, he just wanted me to look at 1907 and 1908, but I needed the money, so I kept pushing the boundaries back. Within a couple of weeks, I found the Lyerly murder, and then I kept finding more and more. Meg. One thing that really struck me about The Man from the Train was your commitment to facts. Some true crime books like to set a scene, speculate, even create dialogue to enhance the story. What led to you and your dad's decision to stay firmly in the corroborated facts? Rachel McCarthy James. That's very kind of you to say, but I do think we wade a bit into speculation. We speculate on many things about his motivations and process, how he approached and chose families, how quickly he did his work, things no one could ever truly know. We also make guesses about how witnesses might have reacted. But we strived for clarity when departing from the events, as stated in our newspaper sources, and getting into our own reactions to the facts at hand, and tried our best to explain how we arrived at our conclusions. The thing about the facts of this story is that, case to case, they tend to be pretty scant. There's a ton of information about Villisca, perhaps more on that one event than all the others combined. Some of the non-Villisca cases were well covered by contemporary journalists, and the lynchings of Paul Reed and Will Cato have been consistently revisited and discussed in the century that followed. But some murders we have just a few hundred surviving words to go by, not even names sometimes. In the writing process, we referred to them as low-information events. So, when writing about those low-information events individually, we have to stick to just those facts because there are so few of them. There's just nothing more to go on, and almost any scene setting would cross the line too quickly. When these many less described tragedies come together, there's a thudding insistence to them. The facts become hideously easy to anticipate, both for us as researchers and for you as the reader. We barely need to tell you that it was in the middle of the night with the back of the axe and the bedclothes piled on the body and the house locked afterward. It was true in the last chapter and the chapter before that and the chapter before that. We try to stick to the facts of all of these stories we found because, put together, they make their own argument. Kelly, could you give us insight into your research process? What was it like pursuing knowledge from a century ago? And how did you feel when you found a link to or evidence of your theory? That had to be thrilling. Rachel McCarthy James. I'd always enjoyed crime writing and true crime. I was obsessed with In Cold Blood 1965 as a teenager. And of course I'd had Harriet the Spy fantasies. But I could never have anticipated the moment I saw Paul Mueller's name and the relief I felt when Dad, who is always quick to be contrary, saw what I saw. This wasn't just because I figured it out, but because I knew that meant this project would be a book, and that book would also be my book. And at the same time, no one wants to find more murders, especially not more lynchings. And they just kept coming. It's ghastly that it happened, and the excitement quickly wore off when we realized the mountain of work we had ahead of us, especially since I wasn't just looking at the murders in this book. I was looking at hundreds and hundreds of different murders, trying to make sure we didn't miss anything. I tried to catalog every single murder of a family between 1890 and 1920. Of course, there's an emotional adjustment process, but it's a rough slog getting through it. And throughout the 5-year-long writing process, there was the underlying anxiety that I might get scooped. Fortunately, that was unfounded. My research process was basically to comb through newspaperarchive.com and find as much as I could on every crime we decided to include, and we erred on the side of inclusion. I revisited each crime in the book probably half a dozen times at minimum, trying to make sure I hadn't missed anything. We decided to only stick to newspapers with these crimes, no reporting trips. I think there's more to be found in local archives for sure, but with the volume of crimes we were working with, it would have been impossible. The authors of The Man from the Train are certain that Paul Mueller is responsible for 14 family murders, which resulted in 59 victims. They believe there is reason to suspect he was also the murderer of the other 25 families accounted for in the book, yet have less certainty. Meg. From Lizzie Borden to the Villisca murders, I, like many, am fascinated by axe murders. You explore even more about axes in your upcoming book, Whack Job. Why do you think we are so curious about this grim way to die? Rachel McCarthy James. The axe is a primal and vital piece of technology, employed both as a tool and a weapon. People have certainly met violent ends with axes since before we were Homo sapiens. Axes have always been around, available, and, until very recently, extremely commonplace, so it's always been a very convenient weapon, and thus it's played the instrument in many interpersonal murders, not to mention the heavy weight of state violence in executions and battle. An axe resonates deeply with our most base instincts. In today's world, where axes are less and less at hand and guns are everywhere, the idea of the axe is just a bit incongruous with our conception of murder. The idea of the axe murderer is just a little bit absurd, which is why it was so effective in The Shining 1980, and why it became such a meme. Kelly. How would you compare the killer in The Man from the Train to modern-day serial killers? Are there any other killers who have similar characteristics, whether in how they travel or carry out their crimes, that you think would make a good modern comparison? Rachel McCarthy James. Serial killers today are fundamentally different from serial killers in centuries past, because today we understand what serial killers are. In the 1910s, they didn't get that. The concept of someone targeting and murdering people for no good reason was completely alien to them. Meg, I think The Man on the Train could make for a fascinating film. Do you think it would translate well in this medium? Rachel McCarthy James, hopefully I'll have more to say about this soon. Wink. Kelly, do you think there is a difference in the way the media handles antique murders versus modern murders? Is it easier for us to forget the humanity of the victims when they died so long ago? Rachel McCarthy James, Sometimes I think the distance can actually help us see the tragedy more clearly. When people are reacting to a murder that's just happened, it's easy to project ourselves onto the victims or react to details taken out of context with authority we don't have. The media environment around murder can distort the facts as they emerge, and people start to pick and choose the details they promulgate or dismiss. Additional time grants us the perspective to see more of the story at once. Though, of course, many of the details are lost, which can be its own distortion. With a more recent murder, you have to be so careful because it's in part about people who are still living, the survivors of the victim, the witnesses, the accused. But it's easy to forget that, especially if it's in that not especially recent but not forever ago space, where curious onlookers are naturally drawn to the mystery, and where the mystery can begin to take precedence over the living people involved. With older crimes, there's more of an opportunity for patience. Meg, can you tell us more about Whack Job? What other projects can we look forward to? Rachel McCarthy James, I'm so excited about Whack Job. It's a journey through our shared humanity, often at its worst, but also at its most creative, most vulnerable, most primal. Each chapter chronicles a different violent death, some from 500,000 years ago, some as recent as 2019, and how that specific episode in brutality reflects the circumstances of the acts in the time and place where it happened. I'm immersed in research right now, and I'm learning so much about violence, about technology, about royalty, and evolution and archaeology. I can't wait to share it, hopefully in 2023. That's my primary project right now, but I've got a ton of other long-term stuff in the works. And I might dive back into the story of the man from the train at some point, too. Wink. It was an honor to speak with Rachel McCarthy James, and we are waiting not so patiently to read Whack Job. Section 9. Home Invasion. Chapter 25. The Strangers. Charles Manson. Home invasion is a terrifying prospect for anyone, regardless of the outcome. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, an estimated 3.7 million household burglaries occurred each year on average from 2003 to 2007. In about 28% of these burglaries, a household member was present during the burglary. In 7% of all household burglaries, a household member experienced some form of violent victimization. While only a small number of home invasions end in the unthinkable, they are still a real and palpable threat. This is the premise of the 2008 film The Strangers. Director Brian Bertino recalled reading Helter Skelter, 1974, about the Charles Manson murders. I was thinking about the Tate murders and realizing that these detailed descriptions had painted a story of what it was like in the house with the victims. But none of the victims knew about the Manson family or why it was happening to them, so I got really fascinated with telling the victim's tale. Charles Manson is the cult leader responsible for the murders of at least 7 people, including actress Sharon Tate. How does one get involved in a cult, and what is the psychology behind them? To understand more about this topic, we interviewed Dr. Janja Lalich, a researcher, author, and educator specializing in cults and extremist groups. Kelly, tell us about your background and areas of expertise. Dr. Lalich, I was in a cult myself in the 70s and 80s. I had already had my college degree and all of that, so when I got out after 10 years, I tried to figure out what happened to my brain. Eventually, I was better, and after about 10 years, I decided to go to grad school, and I got my PhD. I had already written a couple of books and was working with Margaret Singer, who was the preeminent cult expert at the time, and continued researching cults. Meg: before you got into this cult, did you know much about them? Dr. Lalich: no. I was a French major for my bachelor's degree, and then I got a Fulbright fellowship and studied another year in France. I came back. It was the 70s. I was a hippie. I didn't know much about cults until I got in one, and of course I didn't think I was in a cult, even though the newspaper in San Francisco would write articles about us saying we were a cult. We just did damage control when all of that happened. Because I had been in a political cult, and everything at the time was about religious cults, one of the first things I did when I got out was compare how we were a cult, given the criteria for religious cults. And yeah, we were in a cult. I started going to conferences, and I was probably the first person that really talked about political cults. Meg: Charles Manson was a known cult leader. What can you tell us about his style of manipulation? Dr. Lalich: I actually thank my lucky stars that I didn't get recruited by Charlie Manson, because when I was a hippie, I was traveling around in East Bay and San Francisco at that same time he was around. His main style of manipulation was sex and drugs. Most cults don't use drugs on their members. He would give these girls LSD and then have sex with them. That, to me, is the main way he manipulated people. Kelly: when researching the Heaven's Gate cult, I was astonished to realize that they often changed terms to reprogram the mind to disassociate from memories and regular thinking. Is this common in cults? Dr. Lalich: Robert Lifton in his research uses the term loaded language. I think all cults do that. They create their own terminology. They may even be the same words that we use, but they have a different meaning. That has two purposes. It does what you were saying. It dissociates people from the world they had been living in before. And it's also a way to control them. It stops the critical thinking. Like when you hear that word, you know exactly what it means. You know exactly what to think. You know exactly what to do. Over time, it shuts down your critical thinking ability. Kelly: when did this science emerge about cults? Dr. Lalich: Lifton studied the thought reform program in communist China in 1961. Edgar Schein complemented Lifton's work with his book Coercive Persuasion, 1961. Those works had been out there, but I don't think anybody applied it to cults until Margaret Singer, who had worked with Lifton and Schein. In the 70s, parents would come to her because their kids were being recruited by the Moonies or the Children of God. And she remembered back to her work and thought, these cults were like the Chinese thought reform programs. She was really the first one who brought that out. Meg: is any one type of person more prone to becoming ensconced by a cult, or are we all possible victims? Dr. Lalich: in my opinion, everyone is susceptible. If there's any common denominator, it's idealism. Most people join a group because they think they're going to create a better world or a better life for themselves. Or maybe it's financial success or the path to salvation. It's an idealistic motivation on the part of most people. It's not because people are weak or stupid, which is what the myths are. And it's typically not the cult leader who does the recruiting. It's his or her members. A charismatic leader, if we want to call them that, just needs to get a couple of followers. Those followers keep recruiting and sending the message out. Most cult leaders are pretty lazy. They just like to sit back and take the glory. Kelly: in light of what happened in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021, some people are calling Trump's following a cult. Do you agree with that? Dr. Lalich: I think that a great majority, including the QAnon people, were in a kind of cultic relationship with Trump. And he certainly behaved like a cult leader, constantly riling them up, having those rallies, using buzzwords, not allowing any criticism, getting rid of people in his administration who didn't fully support him. I think we definitely saw, for the first time in our country's history, a cult on a national scale. Meg, what else do you think is important for people to know about cults? Dr. Lalich. One thing I think that's difficult for people to understand is this idea of charisma. We attribute charisma to people, and that, from the get-go, is a power relationship. That's an imbalance of power. The one that you attribute the charisma to has power over you. It's this individual relationship, and that's so much of what the hook is. Dr. Lalich has written extensively about cults in her books, Captive Hearts, Captive Minds, 1994, Cults in Our Midst, 1995, and Bounded Choice, 2004. Thank you to Dr. Lalich for the fascinating interview. Charles Manson preyed on all aspects of the hippie zeitgeist to serve his purposes, from the Beatles to the Commune, where he would isolate his followers from their family and friends. Manson would give them hallucinogenic drugs, and he would pretend he was also taking a drug, but he wouldn't. Then he would manipulate their trip and suggest things to them in a vulnerable state, guiding them through a journey where, at the end, they believed completely in him. We see the end of the film first in The Strangers. We hear the recording of a 911 call after two boys discover murdered bodies in a house. What is the history of 911? The service wasn't invented until 1968 in the United States. Before that year, people who were experiencing an emergency needed to dial their local 10-digit number that corresponded to the agency they needed. 2 years prior to the service being implemented, the National Academy of Sciences published a report that proved accidental death and injury, particularly from motor vehicle crashes, had become an epidemic in the U.S. The report urged a series of steps to reduce these needless deaths and injuries, including exploring the feasibility of designating a single nationwide telephone number to summon an ambulance. The film moves to a flashback and shows the couple before they met their demise. Kristen, Liv Tyler, and James, Scott Speedman, are on their way back to the cabin after a wedding reception. It's refreshing to see a horror movie cast people who are a little bit older, not the typical teenage types. It's also interesting to see that the couple is not in a perfect place in their relationship. Their strained rapport adds depth and dimension to their characters and makes the storytelling more complex. They have apparently not gotten engaged this evening, much to the chagrin of James. They have a reconciling of sorts a little after 4 a.m., but are interrupted by a knock at the door. Having lived in the country for most of my life, I, Kelly, can attest to how strange it would be to have someone show up and knock on your door in the middle of the night. We lived at the end of a long dead-end driveway at least 20 minutes from the nearest town. When we saw headlights coming down our driveway at night, it alerted us that either someone was lost or someone we knew was coming over. The knock at the door belongs to a woman looking for someone named Tamara. Something I like about this scene is that we don't often find women to be scary. We don't assume that they will be an aggressor or a threat to us. So having the first encounter with a stranger in this film be a woman usurps our expectations. James leaves Kristen alone in the cabin while he goes on a cigarette run. This is a more common horror movie trope. A woman alone equals potential danger. Kristen is alone in the cabin listening to music on a record player. Nothing could be more calming or soothing to the viewer. Yet we know, since this is a horror movie, that something bad is about to happen. She hears a bang on the door, then another bang. After a gentle knock, the same woman asks through the door if Tamara is home. This is our first clue that something is not right here. One of the scariest non-jump scares in horror movie history occurs in this film. After a few more aggressive bangs on the door, a dead cell phone, and a fire mishap. A figure appears behind Kristen as she smokes her cigarette. The figure is masked and makes no noise, but the viewer knows that Kristen is in grave danger. By the time she turns around, the figure is gone, but we hear a noise, and so does she. These moments build anticipation and fear in the audience. During production of The Strangers, it was reported that Liv Tyler came down with tonsillitis due to the extensive screaming the role required her to do. Tyler would later recall it being the most difficult film she had ever worked on, both physically and emotionally. What is happening to our brain when we get scared? First, the amygdala scans for threats and signals the body to respond. Next, our brainstem may trigger a freeze response, while our hippocampus turns on the fight-or-flight response. Our hypothalamus signals our adrenal glands to pump hormones, and our prefrontal cortex interprets the event and compares it to past experiences. Finally, our thalamus receives input from the senses and decides to send information to either the sensory cortex, conscious fear, or the amygdala, defense mechanism. Some people enjoy the sensation or emotion of feeling fear, while others do not. How you react depends on several factors, including your past experiences with fear, your personality, the people around you, and the type of fear you're experiencing. For example, if you're attending a haunted house or watching a horror movie, you expect to be frightened. But being in real danger or peril will cause a different type of fear, and you will react accordingly. Like the villains in the movie, some enjoy causing fear in others to witness their reaction or to assert power and control over them. The couple can't escape with the vehicles on the premises. Could they if they had known how to hotwire a car? Maybe. Is hotwiring a vehicle as easy as movies make it seem? To the trained eye, it is possible to hotwire an older model of a car by removing the steering column cover and finding the wires that connect to the battery, ignition, and starter. Stripping the wires and twisting them together will start the car, but this is not recommended unless you have experience. And of course, you own the car. Kristen tries to use the Citizens Band CB radio in the barn, but Dollface, Gemma Ward, smashes it before she's able to announce her location. What is the science behind CB radios? Citizens Band radio originated in the United States in the 1940s, and the FCC approved them for use as a hobby in the 1970s. They use 40 channels, and because of federal limitations, the range is no more than 30 miles. Like other land mobile radio services, multiple radios in a local area share a single frequency channel, but only one can transmit at a time. The radio is normally in receive mode, to receive transmissions of other radios on the channel. When users want to talk, they press a push-to-talk button on their radio, which turns on their transmitter. One of the final scenes of the film is very reminiscent of Halloween, 1978. Kristen hides in a pantry with a slat door, akin to Michael Myers, Nick Castle, trying to find Laurie Strode, Jamie Lee Curtis in the famous slasher movie. She is indeed found, and meets her fate alongside her lover, or perhaps now fiancé. She is now wearing the originally abandoned engagement ring as they declare their love for one another. It's been speculated that The Strangers could have been based on the Ketty murders from 1981, an unsolved quadruple homicide in Ketty, California, a rural resort town in the Sierra Nevada. The initial investigation was disorganized and poorly conducted, resulting in the overlooking of crucial evidence. Kristen doesn't die. She is alive when the boys discover the cabin later. The killer's masks are removed, but we, the audience, never see their faces. This makes the premise and conclusion all the more terrifying. Why did the killers do this? We may never know, which is where the true horror lies. Chapter 26. Speck. Richard Speck. On July 13, 1966, Richard Speck murdered 8 student nurses in their home. This horrific and terrible crime shook the city of Chicago as well as the nation. To understand life in Chicago at that time, we spoke to Robert Florence, my father-in-law, and former resident of Chicago during the time of the murders. Kelly, describe what life was like for you specifically and Chicagoans in the summer of 1966. Robert Florence. In 1966, I was in college at the University of Illinois. I was off that summer from school, working in a factory in the plant where my dad was a research chemist. We were in the throes of the Vietnam War, and that consumed the news. There was no thought at the time of a serial killer. Meg. Do you remember where you were and how you found out about the horrific murders that took place that summer? Robert Florence. I do not recall exactly where I was when I heard the horrific news, but the local and national TV channels and the Chicago and national newspapers were replete with stories and details of the Speck murders. We were horrified about just how the murders occurred one by one, with the nurses almost certainly knowing what their ultimate fates would be. Kelly. Did you, your family, or your friends follow the news about Richard Speck? Robert Florence. My family and I, as well as the entire Chicagoland area and the nation, were fixated on the horrible news. It hearkened to the relatively recent news about the Boston Strangler, 1962 to 1964, so I think that was fairly fresh in our minds. Nonetheless, the city was blindsided that another serial killer in our town could happen so quickly in the aftermath of what happened in Boston. Most of us had long forgotten the physician who was a serial killer in the 1890s during the Columbian Exhibition, H. Holmes. Ironically, that also occurred on the south side of Chicago. The Chicago Strangler is the nickname given to an American serial killer, or killers, suspected of raping and murdering at least 55 women and girls in southwestern Chicago between 2001 and 2020. The killings were combined only in 2018, and until then they were considered to have been committed by different perpetrators. Nevertheless, representatives of the Chicago Police Department told the media in 2019 that there might actually be several serial killers operating in the city. Meg. Did knowing about this terrible crime affect how you or your sisters lived your lives after that point? Robert Florence. The news of Speck's murders did rattle us some, since it reminded us of the evil that lurks among us. However, we lived in a quiet suburb on the northwest edge of the city, far from where the murders occurred. That area of the city was so different than the suburbs that it almost seemed non-existent to us. Kelly. What stands out to you most about that summer? Robert Florence. The pictures of Speck with his evil-looking, gaunt, pockmarked face were burned into my mind and the minds of others. To this day, I firmly believe that myself and others in the Chicago area could pick his picture out of a huge lineup. The other thing that I remember was the haunting tattoo that he sported on his arm, "Born to Raise Hell," and how prophetic those words were in coming to fruition. In the aftermath of the murders, the news was full of stories and interviews with the only surviving nurse, Corazon Amaral. We could all relate to the horrors that she must have experienced. Amaral said in an interview 50 years later that, "After that night, I'm always scared, you know." She married and raised 2 children, one of which became a nurse herself. A film version of the events of that night, Speck, was released in 2002. The actor playing Richard Speck, Doug Cole, is seen shooting up drugs in a bathroom stall very early on in the movie. It was reported that Speck, in reality, did heroin. How does this drug affect the body? Within moments after injection, heroin is turned into morphine by the brain. The brain's receptors receive it and release endorphins and dopamine, known as the pleasure hormone. The rush of heroin has been described as feeling similar to a sexual orgasm and can last up to 2 minutes. The rush is followed by a high that can last up to 5 hours. Heroin users then enter a state between sleep and waking that feels drowsy and warm. The brain adapts to these feelings, and when heroin isn't present, the brain and nervous system start to go into withdrawal. Heroin rewrites brain chemistry, in a sense, and causes damage to our thinking and decision-making behaviors. The film, Spec, focuses on the reactions of others rather than letting the audience be witness to acts of violence and rape. Much is seen in a fog or blur, seemingly the way Spec is viewing things or remembering them. The actresses perfectly capture the trauma that the real-life victims experienced. It lasted for a long duration of time and, unfortunately, ended in death for all but one. How does this kind of experience affect survivors? Torture and the taking of hostages have existed for millennia. Recent studies show that both can produce post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, symptoms, many of which last a lifetime. Hostage-taking generates its own unique dynamics on the victims, wherein they can suffer from denial, impaired memory, shock, numbness, anxiety, guilt, depression, anger, and a sense of helplessness. Richard Speck was identified through a police sketch that appeared in the evening newspaper after the murders. What is the science behind police sketches? They are a common practice during law enforcement investigations. A forensic artist usually interviews crime scene witnesses and victims about a perpetrator's appearance to create a composite sketch. The composite could be drawn completely by hand or computer-generated. Sometimes, forensic artists use a combination of the two methods. But no matter how fine-tuned the police sketch methodology, the most crucial component of an accurate facial composite is an eyewitness's memory. Our memories are not 100% accurate, though. We may remember things that fit our cultural view of the world or with unrecognized bias. The art and details behind police sketches are more complicated than one might think. When an eyewitness thinks they can't recall a memory, smell may trigger a response. If they remember the smell of the place or the scent of the perpetrator, it can help bring back those visual memories as well. Also, not all police sketches come from memory. Some are filled in from surveillance videos or partial information. Although not always accurate, police sketches have led to the arrest of many notable criminals, including Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh and Baton Rouge serial killer Derek Todd Lee. Studies have shown that hand-drawn police sketches are often more accurate than computer-only composites. Newer programs do a better job at producing more nuanced mugshots. Speck viewed women as either perfect mothers or bad and promiscuous. This psychological condition is known as the Madonna whore complex, as described earlier. Men who hold these beliefs have an inability to view women as complex, independent people. This way of thinking not only links to attitudes that restrict women's autonomy, but also impairs men's most intimate relationships with women. Speck was diagnosed with XYY syndrome, which, in some cases, is believed to make males more prone to aggressive and violent tendencies. XYY syndrome is a rare chromosomal disorder that affects males. It is caused by the presence of an extra Y chromosome. Symptoms may include learning disabilities and behavioral problems such as impulsivity. Intelligence is usually in the normal range, although IQ is on average 10 to 15 points lower than siblings. Speck is seen throughout the film changing his shirt after each murder and combing his hair. During his trial, it was speculated that he had obsessive-compulsive disorder and that this contributed to the events. Many lines of dialogue in the voiceover narration in the film, Speck, were actually quotes from other serial killers, including Ted Bundy, David Berkowitz, Lucien Staniak, Ed Kemper, and Carl Panzram. Speck was also diagnosed with organic brain syndrome, resulting from the cerebral injuries suffered earlier in his life. Most mental illnesses can be traced to biological or genetic factors, but with organic brain syndrome, it can be traced to physical or emotional abuse. The brain cells could be damaged due to a physical injury, a severe blow to the head, stroke, chemical and toxic exposures, organic brain disease, substance abuse, etc., or due to psychosocial factors like severe deprivation, physical or mental abuse, and severe psychological trauma. Symptoms of this condition include the inability to focus or concentrate, extreme rage or paranoia, and memory loss. Speck claimed to have no memory of the murders. According to a 2014 study, amnesia for violent crimes is fairly common. The results showed that amnesia for a violent offense was associated with crimes of passion and dissociative symptoms at the time, but not with impaired neuropsychological functioning. Long amnesic gaps were associated with a state of dissociation surrounding the offense, and with previous blackouts, whether alcoholic or dissociative. Memory often recovered, either partially or completely, especially where there was a history of blackouts or a lengthy amnesic gap. Brief amnesic gaps were likely to persist, perhaps as a consequence of faulty encoding during a period of extreme emotional arousal, or readout. This is a controversial theory, and more research may be needed to truly understand the phenomena of blackouts. Speck murdered 8 women that night in Chicago, but their memories will live on. One victim's family has set up a scholarship in her memory. The Nina Joe Schmalley Scholarship Fund has awarded 25 scholarships, totaling $49,113 to date. Chapter 27. American Horror Story, 1984. The Night Stalker. Between June 1984 and August 1985, a serial killer, serial rapist, and burglar terrorized the residents of the greater Los Angeles and San Francisco areas. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker. His name was Richard Ramirez. A 2016 film version of his story stars Lou Diamond Phillips as the lead, and he bears a striking resemblance to Ramirez. Phillips recalled, "I got to Los Angeles in 1986, literally a year after his reign of terror and after he'd been caught, so the specter of Ramirez was still there, that larger-than-life fear that gripped the community." How did Richard Ramirez get his start? When he was young, he bonded with a cousin over gory Vietnam photos. Are morbid fascinations normal or dangerous? Psychiatrist Carl Jung believed that our mental health depends on our shadow, that part of our psyche that harbors our darkest energies, such as melancholia and murderousness. The more we repress the morbid, the more it foments neuroses or psychoses. To achieve wholeness, we must acknowledge our most demonic inclinations. It's a natural reaction, beginning when we're children, to look toward the gruesome. It can build empathy, or, in opposite extreme cases, tear down sensitivities. Psychiatrist Michael H. Stone describes Richard Ramirez as a made psychopath, as opposed to a born psychopath. He says that Ramirez's schizoid personality disorder contributed to his indifference to the suffering of his victims and his untreatability. A young Ramirez witnessed the murder of his cousin's wife. He didn't appear to have much, if any, empathy for the victim at his age. What could have contributed to this? Numerous studies have been conducted that show how children witnessing violent acts, either at home in the setting of war or in their community, can have long-lasting, sometimes permanent, brain changes. According to the Child Witness to Violence Project, witnessing violence affects children's abilities to learn and affects their behavior. This may make it difficult to establish good peer relationships. Children who witness violence may be more aggressive, fight more often, and are at greater risk to become violent themselves. Footprint science helped identify Ramirez at crime scenes. How is this used by investigators? Forensic podiatry can determine a suspect's gait, footwear, and footprints. Unlike fingerprints, footprints themselves are not necessarily unique. The use of foot-related evidence in criminal investigations dates back to 1862, when Jessie McLaughlin's footprint placed her at the scene of a woman's murder, for which McLaughlin was subsequently convicted. In modern times, forensic podiatrists have assisted law enforcement in investigations since the 1970s. To catalog the evidence of a footprint, it should first be photographed, then measured. If the footprint caused an impression, it should be cast. If possible, the surface that the footprint is on should be taken as evidence, like cutting out a piece of carpet or fabric. Shoes themselves can show wear patterns, and these too can be detected from a print. Maria Hernandez survived an attempted murder by Ramirez when a bullet fired at her ricocheted off the keys she held in her hands as she lifted them to protect herself. But bullet ricochets can be lethal. A notable death caused by ricochet was the hostage Katrina Dawson during the Lint Cafe siege in December 2014, killed by a ricochet from a police bullet when tactical officers stormed the building. Richard Ramirez is a character in American Horror Story 1984, 2019, and is portrayed by Zach Vila. Although the events at the summer camp in the show are fictionalized, many of the scenes portraying his childhood are accurate. We spoke with Zach about his portrayal of Ramirez. Meg, how much did you know about Richard Ramirez before you were cast in this role? Zach Vila, basically nothing. When I got the audition, I didn't even know it was for American Horror Story. When I got the sections of the script for the audition, I was like, oh, there's clearly something off about this character. There's something sordid and or broken and or lascivious about this person. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I'm going to roll with that. At the audition, it became clear that they were directing me toward this person being very violent, broken. So I literally said, weirder? And they said yes. I then came to find out it was Richard Ramirez. As far as the prep, I did seek out information. I read the book by Philip Carlo, The Night Stalker, 1996, cover to cover, and compiled all the information I could. What I mostly stuck with was what victims said about their experiences interacting with him and or being attacked by him, and his life story before he became this infamous serial killer. The progression of his crimes was interesting to me, and obviously very important to see how his psyche and perversion developed. But what was more interesting was how he got there in the first place. Kelly, in my research for this chapter, I came across psychologists saying he was a made serial killer, not a born one. Did you also come across that? Zach Vila, I did. That's a really interesting concept, nature versus nurture. I do agree that he was made. I think that if you have a predisposition genetically to certain deficiencies or imbalances, it can leave you open to developing a psychosis or perversion that you otherwise wouldn't. Certain things in his history, like he didn't have a chance. It's obvious that these factors played into the development of the person he became and the behavior that he exhibited later. Kelly, did you have any rituals at the end of the day to leave the character behind? Zach Vila, for me, I think just getting off the set, getting out of the physical makeup and the physical language. The most realistic thing that codified for me was getting on my motorcycle at the end of the night and cruising home. That kind of visceral jump back into my environment wiped away any sort of memory of being in that place. Meg, what was your biggest takeaway from playing this role? Zach Vila, the crew and the cast of American Horror Story in particular work so hard. It is a tireless and sometimes thankless job some days on set. We easily did 15, 18-hour days a number of times. One in particular, spoiler alert, basically right before my character dies the first time. That was one of the longest days I've experienced on set. My co-star John Carroll Lynch and I were physically exhausted just trying to take care of our bodies and our brains and also make this really visceral, violent performance over and over and over again. There were a lot of techs involved, but they work so hard and care so much at the end of the day about making really great entertainment. Kelly, did you do anything differently to prepare for this role, given that the character was a serial killer? Zach Vila. Anytime you make anything in film or TV or on stage and you're an actor, if it's based on a real person, you're making a version of that person. Sometimes you're going for an accurate portrayal of what they might have been like in real life, but there are so many factors that adjust the tone of a performance. I was using real-life information, and then doing a version of this role and of this person that fit into the world of the TV show. It was absolutely fascinating to learn about the behind-the-scenes aspects of a television series. You can watch Zach Vila in Season 9 of American Horror Story, or check out his band, Sorry Kyle. Section 10. The Strange. Chapter 28. The Amityville Horror, Ronald DeFeo, Jr. When I, Kelly, was in the 8th grade, I read The Amityville Horror 1977 by Jay Anson over a couple of days. Growing up in a religious household, the book's themes of church and the devil terrified me. The book is based on the real-life murders that took place on November 13, 1974 in Amityville, New York. Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed his parents and 4 siblings while they slept that night. At first, DeFeo claimed the murders must be linked to organized crime. But throughout a night of questioning, the picture unfolded and a confession was made. He said, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." What should have been an open-and-shut case took a twist, though. DeFeo soon claimed that he had heard voices in the house that directed him to kill. This supernatural element that plagues the home is the focus of the book and the 1979 film. The creepy children's voices singing la-las over the opening credits while the eyes of the house peer at us through the changing light of dusk brings a literal chill to my bones whenever I rewatch this movie. The score was nominated for an Academy Award, composed by Lilo Schifrin. The film transitions into a stark contrast, with dark thunderous rain and booming lightning, seemingly in perfect timing to the gunshots we see and hear through the windows of the house. Shopping for a new home can be an absolutely thrilling but stressful experience. Imagine touring such a luxurious and beautiful home and not knowing the history that it holds. Does it matter? For some people who may be superstitious or believe in the supernatural, the past of the home absolutely matters. For others, it may not matter so much. It did end up mattering to the Lutz family. They reportedly started experiencing odd occurrences not long after they moved in. Drafts of unexplained wind are featured throughout the film. The family, as well as visitors, feel this strange occurrence. What could cause this in real life? Home inspection experts would point to air leakage issues in the home. These could include drafts coming through doors, windows, power outlets, or even cable TV and phone lines. An energy audit can be conducted, including a blower door test, which depressurizes a home to reveal the location of any leaks. Supernatural experts would point to other possible explanations for these phenomena. Strong paranormal winds have been reported to take place preceding or during seances, present during hauntings, and felt during visions of apparitions. Emanuel Swedenborg, a seer in the 1700s, wrote in his spiritual diary, "A spirit is compared to the wind. Hence it is that spirits have come to me both now and very frequently before, with wind, which I felt in the face. Yea, it also moved the flame of the candle, and likewise papers. The wind was cold, and indeed most frequently when I raised my right arm, which I wondered at, the cause of which I do not yet know. Paranormal researchers over the centuries have reported feeling these types of winds when investigating homes or structures where hauntings have been reported. A laser grid scope can detect any breaks in pattern in a space and are used by modern ghost hunters along with other electronic gadgets. Related to this are perceived temperature differences in spaces. The family in the Amityville Horror experiences feeling cold in certain places or at particular times. According to ghost hunters, a cold spot is an area of localized coldness or a sudden decrease in ambient temperature. Many ghost hunters use digital thermometers or heat-sensing devices to measure such temperature changes. Believers claim that cold spots are an indicator of paranormal or spirit activity in the area. However, there are many natural explanations for rapid temperature variations within structures, and there is no scientifically confirmed evidence that spirit entities exist or can affect air temperatures. A full 49% of prospective homebuyers said they would not consider a haunted house under any circumstances, regardless of price cuts or added perks. But 18% of respondents said the perception of a house being haunted wouldn't factor into their decision-making, nor would they need a concession to buy. The rest said they'd need some type of perk, a lower price, a larger kitchen, or a better neighborhood. Kathy Lutz, Margot Kidder, asks a local priest to come over and bless their new home. When the priest arrives, he experiences seeing the gathering of the flies in the window, the door slamming shut by itself, and a growing sense of unease. Flies gather on the priest's face at an alarming rate until he hears a disembodied voice tell him to get out. As unbelievable as this scene may be, some bugs are attracted to certain people, and individuals' genetics affect our skin temperature, humidity profile, and metabolic rate. Metabolic rate influences local carbon dioxide levels, which, along with ammonia and lactic acid and other aliphatic carboxylic acids, influence landing rates of biting insects like mosquitoes. Each human thus has a largely individual VOC profile, a product of their unique genetics and unique skin microbial profile. In turn, biting insects have each their own specific odorant receptors. A combination of these two parameters likely makes some humans more attractive to each such biting insect compared to others. Our diets may also contribute to an insect's preference for biting someone or not. Further research in this area is needed, but you won't find me signing up for that study. The priest also experiences the wounds of Jesus on his hands. How common has this been throughout history? This phenomenon is known as stigmata and was mentioned in the Bible in Galatians chapter 6, verse 17. This is considered a holy wound, one that Jesus was inflicted with during his crucifixion. The first recorded case took place in 1224 to St. Francis of Assisi while he was on a 40-day fast. He saw an angel and experienced wounds in his hands, feet, and side. In the centuries since, doctors have purported that St. Francis may have suffered from quartan malaria or even leprosy, which would explain hemorrhages of the skin and intense pain. There are over 100 priests in the United States who are trained to perform exorcisms. One priest says he gets 2,000 requests for exorcisms per year. He estimates about 10% of those requests are worthy to be investigated. A common theme in horror movies is a family's dog sensing danger or paranormal activity. Is this possible? Scientifically, it could be explained by dogs' better sense of sight, sound, and smell. A dog's sense of smell is 10,000 to 100,000 times better than a human's. Dogs have been known to detect cancer in humans and even detect pregnancy. Service dogs can read body language to understand mood and predict oncoming seizures or other medical conditions. Others suggest that perhaps we all have a sixth sense when it comes to danger, but humans don't tap into theirs. Pet psychologist Marty Miller said, "Humans judge or deny what they're feeling. Dogs don't judge what is going on in the environment. While our own minds start to analyze what is happening, dogs don't do that. They feel the barometric pressure change and may react by shaking, panting, salivating, and feeling anxious, or they may not react at all." In a 2006 study, 5 dogs were trained to detect cancer based on breath samples. Once trained, the dogs could detect breast cancer with 88% accuracy and lung cancer with 99% accuracy. They could do this across all 4 stages of the diseases. In the opening police investigation scene in the Amityville Horror, experts placed the time of the murder between 3 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. On the first night that we see in the house, the husband wakes up at exactly 3:15 in the morning. What is the science behind waking at this time? According to sleep experts, waking up at 3 a.m. is common and has a reason rooted in history. With the advent of artificial light, humans were able to stay up later into the night and disrupt their natural circadian rhythm sleep cycle. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, sleep was segmented into 2 parts in Europe and North America: first sleep and second sleep. Later, sleep has shifted to be in one segment in order to maximize work time. Sleep experts also cite the fact that by 3 a.m., most people are exiting the deepest cycle of sleep, REM, and naturally wake up more often for the remainder of the night. Dr. Wayne Dyer, a self-help author, said that if you wake up at 3 a.m., don't go back to sleep. These hours before dawn are when you are close to source and a great time of inspiration and creativity. Put your feet on the floor, get out of bed, feel the morning breeze, and listen to your inner thoughts. Both the priest and the nun retched after leaving the house. Carbon monoxide, CO, is the most common and likely culprit in making people feel nauseous. CO can build up from stoves, fireplaces, or furnaces, and can be fatal to humans and animals that breathe it in. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, each year more than 400 Americans die from unintentional CO poisoning not linked to fires. More than 20,000 visit the emergency room, and more than 4,000 are hospitalized. When the priest tries to return to the Amityville house, the car he is riding in loses control. The driver is unable to turn the wheel, the hood flips up, and they crash. Although total steering failure is rare in vehicles, it is possible. Total steering failure, whereby the steering becomes completely unresponsive, can only be caused by a break or disconnection between the steering wheel and the car's wheels. This is more likely to happen in an older vehicle that is susceptible to extreme mechanical malfunctions. If this happens to you, experts recommend easing your foot off the gas and activating your hazard lights to alert other vehicles to your problem. DeFeo used an insanity plea in his trial. What is the history behind this? The McNaughton standard is the classic example of the insanity defense. It originated in Britain, where in 1843, McNaughton murdered the secretary of the Prime Minister in an attempt to kill the Prime Minister, because he believed that there was a conspiracy against him involving the government. The High Court found him insane, and he was hospitalized. The court described what is now known as the McNaughton standard, and in simplified form, it says that at the time of the act, the person had a mental disease or defect that interfered with his ability to understand the nature and quality of the act he was performing, or if he knew so, he did not know it was wrong. The father in the film starts showing signs of paranoia. Paranoia is the feeling that you're being threatened in some way, such as people watching you or acting against you, even though there's no proof that it is true. It happens to a lot of people at some point. Even when you know that your concerns aren't based in reality, they can be troubling if they happen too often. Symptoms may include being defensive, hostile, aggressive, easily offended, and not being able to trust others. Over half of Americans believe that houses can be haunted. To understand more about this phenomenon, we interviewed radio host on Darkness Radio, Dave Schrader, who has appeared on Ghost Adventures 2008 to the present, and other paranormal television shows. Kelly, tell us about your background and training for going into haunted properties. Dave Schrader, there was no formal training for investigating claims of the paranormal, at least not for me. I am a lifetime experiencer and have had many different connections with the paranormal and supernatural. I decided to actively pursue my interests and fascination with history and the hauntings associated with them by just going out, putting myself in the locations, familiarizing myself with the history, and letting the haunting do the rest. It was much more about being in the moment for me than it was to try to break it down and analyze it. I just wanted to see it for myself. Meg, the family in the Amityville Horror come across places in their home that feel cold. How do experts explain cold spots in homes? Dave Schrader, cold spots are associated with most haunted locations. The theory is that the energy it takes for a spirit to manifest actually creates the cold spot. Kelly, what are your experiences with house blessings, cleanings, or exorcisms? Dave Schrader, as an investigator, we try to honor the belief system of the homeowner or experiencer in order to help clear unwanted energy from a location. If you practice a religion other than Christianity, I will try to contact a holy person from that field of belief you ascribe to. I get the basics from them and try to empower the experiencers to do the clearing and take back the space. I find sometimes that setting that intention and following through is enough. I personally will follow up with a prayer or blessing I am familiar with to try to seal the home after the victims of the haunting have done their part. I believe personally that most spirits do not want to scare, and once they realize they are unwanted, they leave or go about their afterlife in other ways without drawing as much attention. The most important element in dealing with clearings is the active participation of the people being affected. Arming them with knowledge and confidence is paramount in the first steps. We all need to realize we are not weak, and we too wield power that can establish clear boundaries. Meg, the priest in the film witnesses flies gathering in an upstairs bedroom as he attempts to bless the home and begins to feel physically ill. Have you encountered any strange phenomena when entering a home or property? Dave Schrader, yes, and I was actually knocked to the ground while investigating the Whaley House in San Diego. It was a powerful energy and moment for me. Instead of leaping to the conclusion that it was a demon or dark force, I realized that the spirit we were most likely interacting with was just angry, hurt, and showing a sign of power because of how his life and legacy were taken from him. I showed respect and empathy, and had no more bad encounters there. With that said, I have entered buildings that left me feeling sick to my stomach or brought on massive headaches. If the spirits are manipulating energy, or the location is on a ley line, or perhaps has been the focus of many terrified people going in and out over the years, they may have imprinted on the location, and you are experiencing a byproduct of that energy and fear. If you are more tuned in than others, that energy may very well affect you. It is always important to examine a location in daylight, and always with a partner to get a good look and understanding of any potential dangers, like loose wiring that can cause shocks, or emit high levels of electric and magnetic field (EMF) energy that can disrupt you and make you feel sick, edgy, or even cause you to hallucinate. It is also good to get a thorough look at it in daylight to see if there are broken windows, holes in the floors, walls, or ceilings that could pose potentially dangerous falls or unexpected breezes. Always be well hydrated because dehydration can cause dizziness, headache, stomach aches, brain fog, energy drain, all symptoms often associated with paranormal activity. Avoid stimulants like high doses of caffeine and nicotine, as those are known to cause hallucinatory issues as well. Be honest with yourself. If you are in a bad mood, emotional, etc., before entering a location, that can also give you false experiences you may attribute to the paranormal. Kelly, is there anything else you think readers would be interested to hear about regarding these topics? Dave Schrader. The afterlife is a question everyone wants immediate answers to, but there is no immediate answer. Be respectful to the living and the dead. They were people too. Ronald DeFeo Jr. may or may not have experienced supernatural beings during his time at the Amityville house, but perhaps if he had treated humans with the same reverence he had treated the voices he heard, his family's story may have had a happier ending. Chapter 29. The Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo. When The Boston Strangler premiered in 1968, movie critic Roger Ebert was not a fan. The problem here is that real events are being offered as entertainment. A strangler murdered 13 women, and now we are asked to take our dates to the Saturday night flick to see why. Gerald Frank's original book was written with the most honorable intentions, I believe. But the movie is something else, a deliberate exploitation of the tragedy of Albert DeSalvo and his victims. Tony Curtis stars as DeSalvo, the serial killer who murdered 13 women in Boston in the 1960s. Parapsychology and extrasensory perception were used in police investigations for this case. It was a controversial decision at the time, but police have been known to use psychics over the past several decades. What is the history behind this process? The College of Policing released a document warning against using psychics if it will distract from the investigation itself. High-profile missing person investigations nearly always attract the interest of psychics and others, such as witches and clairvoyants, stating that they possess extrasensory perception. The person's methods should be asked for, including the circumstances in which they received the information and any accredited successes. Numerous scientific studies have been conducted to test the accuracy of psychic abilities in investigations, but none have shown definitive proof of the practice being legitimate. Psychics helping investigate strange phenomena have been portrayed in horror movies, including Insidious, 2011, and The Frighteners, 1996. The Cold War created paranoia that the Russians might have a monopoly on individuals with psychic abilities working as government intelligence agents, so the U.S. felt the need to pursue the same. A resulting undercover army unit was created in the early 1970s. The program was finally dismantled and declassified in 1995. There were several key facts that were similar in all the cases of the Boston Strangler. First, his victims were all women. Second, there were no signs of break-in, so the victims themselves must have let the perpetrator in. Third, all the crimes apparently took place during the daytime. Finally, there were no signs of struggle, and no physical evidence found for any of the murders. Is this rare? DeSalvo was convicted of the crimes based on his confession, and later, DNA evidence. But usually there needs to be more evidence. The corpus delicti rule, which translates to body of the crime, refers to the requirement that there be some kind of evidence, apart from the defendant's statements, that establishes that someone committed a crime. In some states, the prosecution can't even present evidence of the defendant's confession, for example by playing a recording of it, without this kind of corroboration. DeSalvo was considered a power assurance-motivated rapist. They are prone to taking credit for crimes, and don't consider rape equal to sex. The signs of this type of rapist include attacking to reassure himself of his masculinity by exercising power over women, Lacking confidence in his ability to interact socially and sexually with women, utilizing surprise approaches and may claim to have a weapon, and often described as polite. These types of rapists tend to be insecure, are socially awkward, and often take personal items from victims. It's important to note that rape, in general, is not about sex, but instead about power and control. Statistics show that 45% of rapes are perpetrated by acquaintances of the victim. Every 73 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted, and every 9 minutes, that victim is a child. Meanwhile, only 5 out of every 1,000 perpetrators will end up in prison. In July 2013, DNA was matched between seminal fluid found at the rape and murder of Mary Sullivan and DNA obtained from DeSalvo's nephew, linking DeSalvo to the murder of Sullivan and excluding 99.9% of the remaining population. DeSalvo's body was exhumed, and it was confirmed to be a DNA match. To understand more about how DNA is used in investigations, we spoke to Lisa Schliebe, a forensic DNA criminalist. Kelly. Movies and fictional TV crime shows routinely use DNA evidence to prove the guilt or innocence of the accused. How accurate is DNA science and the techniques portrayed fictionally compared to real life? Lisa Schliebe. In most cases, whether portrayed in novels or on TV, the science is about 50% accurate. Many of the techniques for collection and testing are well known and are portrayed well. However, the time frame that it takes to get a result is usually skewed for drama purposes. The involvement of the scientist in the case, usually alongside the detective, is greatly exaggerated as compared to real life. The biggest part that always seems to be missing is what happens in court. Having the scientist on the stand and explaining to a jury what tests were done and what the results mean are a large portion of our job. That is a part you rarely read about or see. Meg. Can you explain to us and to our readers how DNA science came about, and how do you see the science advancing in the next decade or so? Lisa Schliebe. The earliest techniques were based on serology methods such as blood type, and we needed large drops of blood roughly the size of a quarter. As we learned more about the structure and how it replicates, the methods became what they predominantly are now, which is copying specific repeated segments that allow us to develop a DNA profile. We are now able to do this with a drop so small it can fit on the head of a pushpin. The science is already advancing beyond what we thought possible, as companies are developing ways to see the full DNA sequence of a person, rather than small repeated segments. This change brings into play the use of ancestry information and physical traits like hair and eye color as ways to identify persons involved in a crime. I think that aspect may have the greatest benefit to cold cases where we've exhausted every other option. I see the current companies developing more sensitive kits, allowing us to test more and get better results. We've already come a long way, but there are always advances to be made. Kelly. How long does it really take to process DNA evidence, and what does it entail? Lisa Schliebe. Let me start by explaining what is normal as it pertains to processing casework, and then I'll tell you what is possible, but only on the rarest of occasions. The actual processing of DNA in the lab takes about 2 to 3 days on average. Why it takes so long to get report results is because of all the before and after activities. The evidence has to be screened for possible biological fluid and samples taken before the DNA process starts. After the lab work is the interpretation, which can take the longest time. A lot depends on the quality of the evidence and if we have access to reference samples to compare to. After this, the report is written, and then the case as a whole goes through 2 layers of review before the report is made available to the investigating officer. For my agency, we have a standard 90-day turnaround time, The clock starts once the request is received and reviewed by our unit, and we've verified that all evidence is booked and ready for analysis. Now, as far as what is possible, when we have situations of increased danger to the public, such as an active serial case, we have the ability to turn around a request in a few days. As I mentioned, that is on the rarest of occasions, but has been done. George Nasser, the inmate DeSalvo reportedly confessed to, is among the suspects in DeSalvo's case. He is currently serving a life sentence for the 1967 shooting death of an Andover, Massachusetts gas station owner named Irvin Hilton. Meg, for those who are interested in pursuing a career like yours, what advice would you give them? Lisa Schliebe. You must have an undergraduate degree in a physical science, biology, chemistry, physics, etc. After that, it is highly recommended that an internship is completed and that a graduate degree is achieved. While these are not required, the field has become extremely competitive, and most of the applicants have advanced degrees and/or work experience in science labs. Anything you can do to make yourself stand out is the best advantage to have. Great advice for those interested in pursuing this important area of science and crime investigation. Because there was no physical evidence at the time and he did not match witness descriptions, DeSalvo was never tried in any of the Boston Strangler murders. He was, however, sent to prison for life for the rapes and sexual assaults from his past. He was sent to prison in 1967 to serve his sentence, but 6 years later he was stabbed to death in his cell. Chapter 30. Eaten Alive. Joe Ball. I, Kelly, heard a story as a child of a family friend who was chased by an alligator in Florida. She remembered a tip: run in a zigzag pattern. An alligator won't be able to turn as quickly as you can, and you'll be able to escape. She did, indeed, usurp the alligator, but fell and broke her arm in the conquest. I remembered this piece of advice throughout my life, and have, thankfully, never needed to use it. The horror movie Eaten Alive, 1976, doesn't feature anyone being chased by an alligator, but instead focuses on a real-life serial killer who may have used alligators to hide evidence of his crimes. Joe Ball is the suspected serial killer who may have murdered as many as 20 women in 1930s Texas. A young Robert Englund, who horror fans will recognize from A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984, plays Buck in the movie. Englund, a classically trained actor, was excited to work with multiple legendary actors on the film. Walking onto the set the first day, he recalled thinking, "God, this is going to be a great movie. I'm so glad I said yes." He was also excited to work with master director Tobe Hooper. Like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, Hooper explores the terror that lurks in seemingly wholesome settings. The film relishes showing abandoned or derelict scenery. These settings have come to be synonymous with strange, creepy loner types. Water-stained walls create an atmosphere of rotting and neglect, while country music creates the juxtaposition of happiness and innocence. The soundtrack for Eaten Alive is similar to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Both were composed by Tobe Hooper and Wayne Bell. They use real elements and sounds found in the environment to create an unsettling atmosphere. Happy, upbeat music plays within the world via the radio or record player, while ominous, dread-building tracks underscore and help create tone. Joe Ball was a bootlegger during Prohibition. Bootlegging helped lead to the establishment of American organized crime, which persisted long after the repeal of Prohibition. In one scene, a man behind a desk turns from jolly to intimidating when learning that the young woman he's speaking to is a sex worker. The man is Judd, Neville Brand, who is a fictional version of serial killer Joe Ball. Ball has gone down in history as a folklore figure in Texas. The strange stories behind Ball's killings include bodies being disposed of in barrels and others fed to alligators. The latter is what the film version of his life focuses on. Part of the legend of Ball includes the story that he built a pond with alligators because he misunderstood the term corpus delicti, a legal term meaning a murder conviction without a body would be impossible. Whether this is the real reason Ball kept alligators is speculation. But the legal term is much clearer. The corpus delicti rule does not mean a dead body must be produced to prove a murder took place. But it does mean that the prosecution must produce some independent evidence of a crime before being able to introduce a defendant's confession or admission to a crime. Ball was never formally charged, so this rule is a moot point. Have people ever used alligators or other animals to dispose of bodies? Disturbingly, the answer is yes. In 1902, a hog farmer named Joseph Brigham was sentenced to life in prison for murdering at least a dozen people and feeding them to his pigs. He claimed that human remains made his pigs grow larger and taste better. In 2007, a jury convicted Canadian serial killer Robert Pickton of killing and feeding 49 sex workers to his hogs. Owning an alligator is legal in some states. 5 states have no license or permit requirements regulating the ownership of exotic pets. The group includes Alabama, Nevada, South Carolina, and Wisconsin. Alligators can be owned in Florida with a permit. Whether Joe Ball actually fed his victims to his alligators or crocodiles in the film, it got us wondering, what do crocodiles actually eat? And how long does it take for them to consume something? Crocodiles can, and sometimes will, eat anything they encounter. A croc's stomach is the most acidic of all vertebrates, allowing it to digest bones, horns, hooves, or shells. Nothing gets left behind in a crocodile's dinner. The dog in this film dies by getting eaten by a crocodile. But does this happen often? In 2019, it was reported that 12 dogs were attacked in one county in Florida that year. There are several hundred crocodile attacks per year in Africa alone, and it is said to be far more likely to get attacked by a crocodile than a shark. Hattie, Carolyn Jones, calls the animal an alligator, while Judd refers to it as a crocodile. What is the difference between the two? The snout shape and jawline are the easiest way to spot the difference between the two animals. Alligators have a U-shaped snout, while crocodiles have V-shaped ones. Alligators are opportunistic feeders. They typically won't chase people down unless provoked, while crocodiles tend to be more aggressive and therefore dangerous. That must mean our family friend was provoking the alligator that chased her. The plot thickens. It's legal to own a crocodile in Australia, but they must be kept under 60 centimeters long or less than 2 feet. The father and sister of the first victim help search for her. How often do families get involved in missing persons cases? It is quite common for families to be directly involved in these cases, according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Nearly 800,000 children are reported missing each year. 203,000 children are kidnapped each year by family members. Another 58,200 are abducted by non-family members. Despite these huge numbers, very few children are victims of the kinds of crimes that so often lead local and national news reports. According to NCMEC, just 115 children are the victims of what most people think of as stereotypical kidnapping. Of these 115 incidents, 57% ended with the return of the child. The other 43% had a less happy outcome. The first 48 hours of a person missing due to possible crime are the most crucial, and families are encouraged to work closely with law enforcement officials to help locate their loved one. Judd keeps notes of all his victims in the film. Is this common for serial killers? Throughout history, diaries or notes written by serial killers have been found. Forensic psychology professor Dr. Catherine Ramsland said, "Those killers who want their secrets recorded take a risk. Some simply don't believe they'll be caught, but others might have such a compulsion to record their deeds that while they're declaring their sense of power, they reveal how powerless they really are." Eaten Alive was filmed on sound stages in Hollywood. A large-scale pool doubled as the swamp, and Tobe Hooper said he wanted to create a surrealistic Twilight world with the soundstage. 2 other recent movies explored killer crocodiles with interesting and unique premises. The Pool, 2018, was also shot in a large-scale pool that was imperative to its plot, while Crawl, 2019, took place during a Category 5 hurricane and could be described as a home invasion-style horror movie, except with alligators as the invaders. The survivors in many horror movies are able to push through to the end, even when exhausted or injured. How does adrenaline work in our bodies? Adrenaline is the body's answer to the fight-or-flight response. When humans sense danger, adrenaline can send extra oxygen to the lungs, decrease the body's sense of pain, increase physical strength, and sharpen focus. People have been known to accomplish extraordinary feats with a surge of adrenaline. In 2006, a man was able to lift a 3,000-pound car off of someone, while that same year a woman fought off a polar bear until it was shot by a local hunter. Judd bites it in the end of Eaten Alive by getting bit by one of his alligators. But what happened to the real killer? Joe Ball died by suicide in 1938 after being approached by 2 sheriff's deputies. He is confirmed to have killed 2 women, Minnie Gotthard and Hazel Brown, but may have murdered up to as many as 20 women. The alligators were taken to the San Antonio Zoo, and Joe Ball became a notorious legend called the Bluebeard of South Texas. Although the facts and exact number of victims may never be known, one thing is for certain: Joe Ball was a monster who preyed on women. Conclusion. It's important to note that the serial killers in this book created ripple effects of grief that still resonate today. Our hope is that we illuminated some of their victims' stories, while delving into the history and circumstance of when they were alive. Whatever their background, the killers within this book were creators of their own monstrosity, both Dr. Frankenstein and his murderous creature in one. We like it better when the movie lights shine on the make-believe horror, when the good guys win, and when the only upset is not enough butter on our popcorn. There has been enough true horror to last cinematic lifetimes. If you want to learn more about horror films and the people and stories behind them, read more of our series, The Science of Monsters, The Science of Women in Horror, and The Science of Stephen King. We hope you've enjoyed this unabridged novel audio production of The Science of Serial Killers, the truth behind Ted Bundy, Lizzie Borden, Jack the Ripper, and other notorious murderers of cinematic legend, by Meg Hafdahl and Kelly Florence, produced by B Audio Limited, executive producer Jennifer Stoke, with editing and mastering by Noah Cass. Quality control by Steffi Schulze. Audiobook copyright 2021 by Novel Audio Inc. Print and ebook copyright 2021 by Meg Hafdahl and Kelly Florence. If you liked this recording and want to see a full catalog of our titles, please visit www.novelaudio.com. Thanks for listening.